On the evening of October 12, 1971, the lights of the Marston farmhouse glowed faintly through the mist that settled over Hollow Creek. From the gravel road, a passerby could see the outline of a family gathered around their table, 4 silhouettes framed in gold lamplight. Inside, a radio hummed softly between crackles of static, the smell of roast chicken drifting through the windows. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary Wednesday. Richard Marston was a mill foreman, quiet and deliberate. His wife, Ellen, kept the house with a warmth that neighbors often called the light of Hollow Creek. Their children, Anna, 10, and Luke, 8, chased each other down the hall until Ellen called them to sit. It was 7:38 p.m. when the family said grace. By 9 p.m., no one in Hollow Creek would ever see them alive again. At 9:12, Mrs. Gates, who lived across the cornfield, noticed the farmhouse lights flicker, once, twice, then steady again. She thought nothing of it until her dog began to bark toward the woods. Around 9:20, a single car was heard pulling onto the dirt road, its engine idling briefly before fading away. No visitor was expected that night. When dawn came, mist lay heavy over the fields. Richard's foreman called the house after the mill whistle blew. No answer. By noon, Ellen's sister drove over, uneasy that no one had picked up the phone. She found the mailbox stuffed with yesterday's paper, the front door locked, curtains drawn. Through the window, she could see the dining table still set. 4 plates, 2 glasses half empty, a candle burned down to a crooked spine of wax. The roast sat cold, untouched. Deputy Sheriff Frank Daly arrived shortly after 2 p.m. He broke the latch on the back door and entered. The radio was still playing faintly. Bridge over troubled water, its needle trapped in a looping skip. The air was thick with the stale smell of extinguished wax and something metallic, faint like wet coins. Upstairs, beds lay made, pajamas folded, as if the family had simply stepped away mid-evening. Every clock in the house had stopped at 9:17 p.m. Daly's report noted no sign of struggle, no forced entry, no valuables missing. Only one chair at the table had been pushed violently backward, its leg splintered against the floorboard. A trail of faint mud prints led from the doorway toward the kitchen window, then vanished. Outside, deputies swept the yard. They found tire marks overlapping the Marston's own tracks, larger, heavier treads from a county vehicle or pickup. A neighbor mentioned hearing a man's voice shouting once, then silence. By sunset, the sheriff ordered a full search of the creek and surrounding woods. Nothing. No footprints beyond the field's edge, no car, no bodies, no blood. Reporters arrived from the local paper by nightfall, snapping photos of the porch and the untouched dinner plates. Hollow Creek's first major disappearance case had begun. In the official statement, Sheriff Daly spoke carefully to the cameras. There is no evidence of foul play at this time. The family may have left voluntarily. But off-record, deputies whispered about the stopped clocks, the untouched food, the locked doors. One called it the dinner that never ended. Days turned to weeks. The town gathered nightly at the church, lighting candles that guttered in the cold. Volunteers searched the cornfields by lantern light, calling the children's names into the wind. Each call echoed back unanswered. Ellen's sister stayed in the house for 3 nights after the search began, unable to leave. On the 3rd night, she swore she heard footsteps in the hallway. Light, quick, a child's run, yet the floor was empty. She left the next morning and never returned. By November, investigators from Harrisburg took over, cataloging every dish, every note, every fingerprint. The dining table was photographed from 7 angles. Those images, glasses mid-sip, silverware glinting under flashbulbs, would later become symbols of the case. Life paused in mid-motion. When winter settled over Hollow Creek, snow gathered on the Marston roof like a white shroud. The search was scaled down. Deputy Daly filed his final note on December 2, 1971. House remains secured. No further leads. All occupants presumed missing. He signed the report, shut the file, and looked once more at the photo of the table. Years later, he would tell a reporter, voice trembling, "They stood up from dinner and never came back." Outside, the farmhouse windows reflected the snowlight, 4 pale squares glowing in the dark, as if the family were still seated within. And while the town slowly moved on, the image of that untouched dinner stayed frozen in memory, waiting, half-eaten, half-answered, for someone to ask again what really happened at Hollow Creek. By the second morning after the Marstons' disappearance, the quiet hum of Hollow Creek had turned to murmurs and suspicion. The farmhouse on Mill Road stood like a frozen photograph, windows sealed, curtains drawn, the faint outline of the dining room visible through the lace. Inside, the 4 chairs remained exactly as Deputy Daly had left them, one overturned, the others neatly pushed beneath the table. It was the emptiness that unnerved people most. In a town where doors were left unlocked and everyone waved at passing cars, the sight of an untouched dinner, uneaten bread, and glasses still half full of water felt like something sacred had been broken. The sheriff's office converted the old town hall into a temporary command center. Maps were pinned across the walls, rivers, trails, logging paths. Volunteers moved in and out with flashlights and thermoses of coffee. Local hunters lent their dogs, and students from the county college joined the search. Trudging through the frost-covered woods, Deputy Daly, who hadn't slept since that first night, kept returning to the table. He would stand there for minutes, staring at those empty chairs as if expecting them to scrape back at any moment. 4 seats, 4 lives, he muttered once to Officer Hardy, and not one clue that tells us where they went. Hardy found a scrap of fabric snagged on the porch railing, a soft floral pattern that matched Ellen's dress from a family photo on the mantel. Lab tests were sent to Harrisburg, but results came back inconclusive. No blood, no fibers from anyone else. Just a tear, like something brushed past in a hurry. The newspapers called it the vanishing supper. Reporters speculated about everything, from family disputes to UFO abductions. One headline read, "Dinner Interrupted. Hollow Creek Family Disappears Without a Trace." For the small Pennsylvania town, it became more than a mystery. It became a story they couldn't stop retelling, each version darker than the last. At the town's diner, old men leaned over their coffee cups and whispered. Some said Richard had gambling debts. Others claimed Ellen had been planning to leave. But no one could explain how 2 children could vanish without a single footprint in the snow. By the end of October, every lead had dried up. The creek had been drained, barns searched, and miles of farmland combed. Deputies filed 127 reports. Nothing connected. On November 3rd, Sheriff Daly visited Ellen's sister, Margaret Hale, for the 3rd time. She sat on her porch wrapped in a knitted shawl, eyes red from weeks of tears. "You think they're dead?" she said quietly. Daly hesitated. "We don't know that. They wouldn't just leave. Not like that." Her voice cracked. "Ellen called me that evening. Said Richard wanted to tell me something, but the line went dead before she could." That statement never made it into the official report. The call logs from 7:40 p.m. to 9 p.m. that night had vanished from the local switchboard archive. The operator swore she'd filed them. Later, she retracted her statement, claiming she must have been mistaken. Something in Hollow Creek wasn't adding up. Winter crept closer. The town's energy drained with each fruitless search. Deputies began referring to the farmhouse as the empty chairs. No one stayed there after dark. The electricity had been cut off, yet some nights, passers-by swore they saw light flicker in the kitchen window, like a candle still burning inside. Daly went there alone on December 1st. He unlocked the door and stepped into the silence. His flashlight beam swept over the table. Dust had begun to settle on the plates. The air was colder now, the kind that carries sound in strange ways. Creaks, distant whispers, imagined footsteps. He reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a photo from the case file. The Marstons smiling beside the barn, Luke holding a small box camera. Daly hadn't noticed it before, but in the background of the photo, barely visible behind the glass reflection, was a faint blur, another figure, tall, indistinct, standing at the tree line. He looked up from the photo to the window facing that same tree line outside. Darkness. Snow falling lightly. Just silence. Daly placed the photo back in the file, locked the door, and made a note in his report. No new leads. But something about that picture feels wrong. We'll review evidence again tomorrow. That note would be the last official entry before the case went cold for 52 years. Outside, snow gathered on the steps. The farmhouse lights remained dark. Only the chairs inside, ghostly in the moonlight, seemed to wait for someone to return. By the first week of December 1971, the Marston investigation had become a quiet embarrassment. The sheriff's department stopped issuing statements. Reporters moved on to fresher headlines. And in the dim, paper-scented archives of Hollow Creek County, the family's case file was sealed inside a thin brown folder stamped with 2 words that would outlast everyone who handled it: filed under silence. Deputy Frank Daly was the last man to touch it. He came into the station that winter morning, coat still dusted with snow, and placed the file in the steel cabinet beside the evidence room. He hesitated before shutting the drawer. Something in him resisted the sound of it closing, that small metallic click that meant it's over. But there was nothing left to chase, nothing left to write. In the months that followed, the farmhouse was sold twice and abandoned twice. One owner claimed the walls whispered when the wind passed through the halls. Another swore he saw candlelight in the dining room even after cutting power to the house. By the end of 1973, it stood empty again, boarded up, forgotten behind tall grass and time. Daly retired in 1981. His final years in uniform were quiet, filled with small-town complaints, missing mail, noise violations, the occasional drunk driver. But every winter, around the anniversary of the Marstons' disappearance, he'd drive down Mill Road and park outside the farmhouse. He never got out of the car, just sat there in silence, headlights off, eyes fixed on the dark windows. Locals used to joke that he was waiting for them to come home. But Daly didn't laugh, because he couldn't shake the memory of that night. The stopped clocks, the footprints that ended mid-floor, the empty chairs staring back at him like questions he couldn't answer. Inside the station, the Marston file gathered dust. New deputies didn't know the names. Some had never heard of Hollow Creek's vanishing supper. When an intern once asked about it, an older clerk shrugged and said, "Old case." Sheriff said, "Let it rest." And so it did. For decades, the story slept inside that drawer. But silence has a strange way of echoing. In 1991, during a remodel of the county building, records were transferred to digital storage. A clerk named Teresa Mullen was tasked with scanning old case files. When she reached Marston 1971 Missing Persons, X4, she paused. The file was thinner than it should have been. Just a few reports, 2 photographs, and a typed statement. No evidence log, no appendices, no physical records. She flagged it for review but received no response. A week later, her supervisor told her to skip it. "Sheriff's orders," he said. The digital entry was marked, "Sealed pending jurisdictional approval." No reason given. Teresa kept a note of it anyway. In her handwriting, she wrote, "Marston case incomplete, something missing. Follow up later." But she never did. She left the department 2 years later after a fire destroyed part of the basement archives, the same section where the physical Marston file had been stored. The official cause: faulty wiring. The damage report: total loss. No one mentioned the missing evidence again. For Hollow Creek, the story had faded into folklore. Teenagers dared each other to sneak into the farmhouse. Paranormal shows filmed segments titled "The Family That Vanished." Local historians called it the Unsolved Quiet. Only one man refused to forget: Frank Daly. By 1994, he was living alone in a cabin outside town. His health had begun to fade, but his mind circled the same mystery. Neighbors said he kept a small box by his bedside filled with old photographs and reports. After his death in 1996, that box was never found. Years later, when his niece cleaned out the cabin, she discovered something strange in the attic crawl space: a rusted metal tin labeled Marston Personal. Inside were a handful of negatives, yellowed with age, and a note in Daly's handwriting. It read, "If you're reading this, the truth isn't gone. It's just buried deeper than anyone wants to dig." The negatives were sent to the County Historical Society for preservation, but no one had the right equipment to develop them. They were placed in a sealed envelope and archived, again under Marston 1971. And so the silence continued. Until 52 years after that night, when a volunteer archivist, sorting through forgotten boxes for a museum exhibit, found the envelope labeled, "Do Not Open." Inside was an old roll of Kodak film, still intact. and what it revealed once developed would change everything Hollow Creek believed about the night the Marstons disappeared. By the time the film from the Marston file resurfaced, the farmhouse had already become a monument to absence. 52 winters had passed since the family vanished, yet the building still stood at the far edge of Hollow Creek, alone, silent, and sinking into its own foundation. Locals drove by with windows rolled up, pretending not to look. Even after half a century, nobody wanted to be the one who said the place still felt alive. The volunteer archivist, Evelyn Hart, had never been to the property herself. She was 27, a history graduate with a quiet fascination for unsolved cases. When she came across the do not open envelope in the museum storage, she didn't realize what she was holding. Only when she read the faint pencil marks, Marston, 1971, did the name ring like a half-remembered whisper from town legend. Evelyn didn't open the envelope right away. Something about the handwriting and sharp deliberate made her uneasy. She decided to trace the location mentioned in the old reports first. That's how, one fog-heavy afternoon in early October, she found herself standing at the end of Mill Road, facing the Marston farmhouse. The place looked older than its years. The paint had peeled into gray flakes. The porch half collapsed under the weight of time. Weeds choked the front steps. One of the upstairs windows hung crooked. Glass fractured into a spider's web of dust and reflection. And yet, the dining room window was spotless, as if someone still wiped it clean from the inside. She stood there for a long moment, her camera hanging loosely at her side. Wind moved through the field, rustling the dry stalks of grass. It sounded almost like whispering. Evelyn stepped forward. Inside, the air felt heavy, thick with dust and cold. Her flashlight caught the faint shimmer of something on the floor. Broken china scattered like pale bones. She passed through the hallway, following the faint outline of old police chalk marks on the wood. The furniture remained covered in gray sheets. But in the dining room, everything was exactly as described in the original report. 4 chairs, one toppled, the table still set for dinner, plates, silverware, a rusted kettle in the center. The smell of decay had long faded, replaced by the scent of mildew and earth. Still, the room carried an unnatural stillness, the kind that hums in your chest rather than your ears. Evelyn raised her phone and took a photograph. For a moment, the flash revealed something unexpected. Handprints, faint and dusty, pressed along the far wall. Small like a child's. She stepped closer, breath shallow, tracing them with her light. They led down toward the baseboard, then stopped. No exit, no continuation. Just a wall of aged wood. She found an old cellar door near the kitchen, sealed shut with rusted nails. The official case file had mentioned it, but the sheriff at the time declared it unsafe for entry. Evelyn hesitated, remembering the thin brown envelope still sitting in her bag. Inside, the undeveloped negatives, the final record left behind by Deputy Daly, waited in silence. Before leaving, she placed her hand on the dining table. The wood was colder than stone. Dust lifted at her touch, swirling into the light. It felt like disturbing a memory that didn't want to be remembered. Outside, dusk had settled over the valley. The house behind her was swallowed by shadow, but one detail followed her. The faint reflection in that clean dining room window. For just a second before turning away, she thought she saw a figure seated at the table, head bowed, motionless. She didn't look back. That night, she returned home and finally opened the envelope. The film inside was fragile, curled with age. There were 12 negatives, on all faint, grainy, and underexposed. But one frame stood out. It showed the dining room of the Marston farmhouse, perfectly lit, as though captured in daylight and seated around the table. Were 4 figures, she froze. The walls, the furniture, even the chipped china were identical to what she'd just seen hours ago. Except this photograph was dated December 12th, 1971. The same night the family disappeared. When she zoomed in, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The 4th chair, the one toppled over in real life, was upright in the photograph. And behind it, in the mirror on the wall, a 5th figure could be seen standing, blurred facing the camera. Her hands trembled. She saved the file, renamed it Marston 001, and in that moment, for the first time in 52 years, the silence around the case cracked open, faint, but enough to let something through. Evelyn didn't know it yet. But the photograph she held wasn't just a record of the past. It was an invitation. The morning after discovering the photograph, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had followed her home. Sleep had come in flashes, broken by dreams of static and slow camera shutters. When she woke, the light outside was thin and gray, the kind that makes the world feel paused. On her desk, the old negatives lay where she'd left them, curled like sleeping things. She turned one over in the light. It was marked with a faint logo, Kodak Tri-X 400, the same stock used by police photographers in the early 70s. There were tiny smudges on the edge, as though someone had handled it with trembling hands. She remembered Daly's note. The truth isn't gone. It's just buried deeper than anyone wants to dig. So she began to dig. Evelyn contacted the Hollow Creek Historical Society, claiming she needed background information for an exhibit. They gave her limited access to the archived police equipment logs, faded with time but mostly intact. Among the entries, she found one that stopped her. Deck 12, 1971, camera Yashica Electro 35, serial 3492B, assigned to Deputy F. Daly, the same night. The same deputy, she scanned further. There was no record of the camera ever being returned. It had simply vanished, like the family it photographed. By noon, Evelyn was driving to the old county storage shed, a low brick building behind the courthouse where obsolete equipment was kept. Inside, the air smelled of oil and damp paper. Rows of rusted shelves leaned under the weight of forgotten hardware. Radios, flash units, tripods, the ghosts of technology left behind. After an hour of searching, she found it. A leather camera case buried beneath a box of old microphones. The tag on the strap read, "Property of H.C. Sheriff's Office." When she unlatched it, the hinges protested with a dry squeal. Inside was the Yashica Electro 35, perfectly preserved. The lens was cracked but clean, the film compartment still loaded. Her breath caught as she saw the tiny strip of paper taped to the back. Marston 1271, roll 3, meaning there were others. Evelyn didn't touch the shutter. Instead, she sealed the camera in a plastic bag and took it to Dr. Harold Niven, a retired forensic photographer who now volunteered at the university lab. He was skeptical at first, but when she told him the year, his expression changed. "Daly's camera?" he asked quietly. "I remember that case. Everyone thought he went too far with it." "What do you mean?" Evelyn asked. Niven wiped his glasses. He'd developed 2 rolls before the sheriff shut him down. Said he was fabricating evidence. The rumor was, he paused, choosing his words, that the 3rd roll captured something that shouldn't have been there. He looked at the camera again, the way one might look at an artifact better left buried. "I can try to develop it," he said finally. "But if this film's been sitting 50 years, you may not like what comes out." That evening, under the sterile light of the darkroom, Evelyn watched as the images began to appear, slowly, almost reluctantly on the paper. Grain by grain, outlines emerged. The kitchen, the hallway, a figure in uniform. Deputy Daly, camera in hand, facing something just out of frame. In another shot, the dining table, untouched, perfect, as though time itself had refused to move on. And then came the final image. It was the same room again, same composition, same table. But this time the light was wrong. Too bright, almost artificial. A faint double exposure blurred the figures around the table, the Marstons, while a 5th shape hovered behind them, faintly translucent, leaning close to the camera as if staring back through it. The negative warped as it dried, a dark streak cutting across the figure's face. Niven said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, "That's not a flaw in the film. That's movement." When Evelyn looked closer, she saw what he meant. The shadow wasn't still. It curved, slightly shifted as though captured mid-turn. She took the print home that night. Outside, rain had started to fall, drumming against the windshield like restless fingers. Each time lightning flashed, she saw the faint reflection of the photograph in the passenger seat beside her, the table, the faces, the blurred shape standing behind them. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been caught in that frame hadn't stayed there. The photo lab lights buzzed faintly above Evelyn as she waited for the last of the Marston negatives to dry. The smell of developer and fixer filled the air, sharp, chemical, timeless. It had been 3 days since she'd discovered the roll of film, and in that time she'd barely slept. What started as curiosity had turned into obsession. 12 frames. Most were dark or half-exposed, fragments of furniture and empty hallways. But 3 images refused to be dismissed. The first was the dining room, frozen in impossible stillness. The second, a hallway mirror reflecting 4 seated figures whose faces looked wrong. Blurred not by motion, but as though something had dragged through the light itself. And the third, the most unsettling, appeared to show someone behind the photographer. Just a vague outline, but too distinct to be an accident. She magnified the scans on her computer screen, pulling each face into focus. The man at the head of the table, presumably Robert Marston, the father, was faintly smiling, but his eyes were closed, like he was waiting for something. The woman beside him, Lydia, had her hand mid-gesture, frozen in conversation. Across from them sat their 2 children, Anna and Peter, both looking off camera toward something unseen. But when Evelyn zoomed in on the reflection captured in the dining room mirror, the logic of the image began to fracture. The reflection did not match the arrangement of the table. There were 5 figures in the mirror, not 4. And the 5th stood behind the children, tall and faceless, one hand resting on the back of Anna's chair. Her breath hitched. She adjusted the contrast, thinking it might be an exposure error, but the outline only grew clearer, a human shape pale against the darkness, its reflection sharper than the people sitting in the room. For a long moment, Evelyn simply stared at the image, feeling her heartbeat echo against the silence of the lab. It was like the photo was waiting for her to notice something else. She printed the frame and pinned it beside the others on the board. Under the harsh light, the pattern of reflections started to form a strange logic. In one shot, the mirror's angle showed the dining table from behind, in another from the side. Yet in every frame, the 5th shape remained exactly the same distance away, in the same stance as if the house itself had been watching. At midnight, Evelyn finally called someone, Detective Mark Ellery, a retired investigator who had handled cold case consultations for the local precinct. His voice over the line was weary but alert. "You said you found these in a sealed evidence box?" "Yes, they were never developed." "From the Marston case." "Marston?" He paused. "You mean the dinner disappearance? That file burned in the archive fire." "Not all of it," Evelyn whispered. "There's more. I think someone else was in that house." Ellery agreed to meet her the next morning. Before hanging up, he added almost reluctantly, "That case, it ruined people. Sheriff Holden lost his badge. And Frank Daly, the one who filed the report, he stopped talking about it entirely. Be careful with what you dig up, Miss Hart. Some stories don't want to be finished." When the call ended, Evelyn turned back toward the wall of photographs. The mirror's reflection glimmered faintly under the dim red light, like it was catching movement from somewhere in the dark. Outside, rain began to fall, soft and steady, tapping against the glass. She switched off the lights, but before leaving, her eyes caught the faint glow of her computer monitor. The last scan, and the one she hadn't opened yet, had finished rendering. The file name read, marston12.tiff. She clicked it open. At first, it looked like another underexposed frame, a blur of black and gray tones. But as the brightness adjusted, the image began to take shape. The same dining room, empty this time. No figures, no plates, just the chairs neatly arranged, facing the table as if awaiting guests. And in the mirror, the same mirror, her own reflection stared back. But she hadn't been there when the photo was taken. The timestamp at the bottom read, October 10th, 2023, 4:12 p.m., the exact time she had first stepped inside the Marston house. Her fingers went numb. The screen flickered once and then went dark. She didn't move. The only sound was the soft patter of rain, steady as a heartbeat. Somewhere between logic and fear, Evelyn realized. Whatever had been inside that house hadn't stayed there. The rain hadn't stopped by morning. Evelyn sat in her car outside the Hollow Creek Police Annex, the envelope clutched tightly in her hands. Inside were the developed photographs, each sealed in protective sleeves. Evidence that shouldn't have existed. The timestamp on the final image still burned in her mind. October 10th, 2023. She told herself it had to be an error, some digital corruption, a glitch during scanning. But the more she stared at the photos, the less that explanation made sense. The exposure, the light balance, even the film grain matched the others perfectly. No digital interference, no overlay. Someone or something had taken that picture exactly 52 years after the Marston family vanished. Detective Mark Ellery met her at the door. He looked like a man worn down by a lifetime of unanswered questions. Gray hair, deep lines around his eyes, a slight limp. But when she mentioned the word Marston, something flickered behind his calm exterior. Recognition. Maybe. Even fear. They sat in the observation room, a small space with mirrored glass and a faint hum of fluorescent light. Evelyn slid the envelope across the table. Ellery opened it with slow, deliberate care, pulling out the photographs one by one. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ellery exhaled. "Where did you get these?" "They were in the county archives," Evelyn said softly. A sealed evidence envelope marked "Do Not Open." The negatives were labeled by Deputy Daly. Ellery nodded. "Frank Daly. I met him once years before he died. He used to say that case was a dinner the devil himself cleared. Everyone thought he was losing his mind. He studied the photo of the dining room, the reflection with the fifth figure. "I've seen hundreds of crime scene photos," he murmured, "but never one that looks alive." "Alive?" Evelyn asked. "Look closely at the shadows," he said. "They're not static. The angle of the light in this shot doesn't match the lamp. It's as if there's a second source, coming from somewhere that isn't in the room." Evelyn leaned closer. He was right. The shadows bent the wrong way, like they were drawn toward the mirror instead of away from it. She hesitated before pulling out one more item from the envelope, something she hadn't shown anyone yet. A folded sheet of yellowed paper that had been wedged behind the negatives. On it, in shaky handwriting, were 6 words. "If you see them, don't speak." Ellery froze. His eyes narrowed. "Who wrote that?" "It wasn't signed. I think it was Daly." He sat back, rubbing his temples. "Daly's niece mentioned once that he kept a private box of case notes, things he never turned in. She said after he passed, most of it went missing." "You think someone took it?" "Or burned it," Ellery said quietly. "Around here, when something's too close to the truth, it tends to disappear." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The only sound was the faint hum of the light above them. Evelyn's hands trembled as she returned the photos to the envelope. But before she could close it, Ellery reached forward, his tone suddenly sharp. "Wait." He pointed to the edge of one print, a faint smudge in the corner that looked almost like a watermark. When he tilted it under the light, the mark became clearer. HCSD, evidence copy. "That means this wasn't Daly's original role," Ellery said. "It was developed by the department years later. Someone accessed that film after the fire." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "But the archives list the negatives as destroyed." "Exactly," he replied. "Which means someone lied." He leaned back, staring through the mirrored glass toward the empty hallway beyond. "There's one person still alive who might know where the originals came from," he said. "Retired Sheriff Holden. But he won't talk, not to me anyway. He hasn't spoken about the Marstons in 50 years. Evelyn nodded slowly. "Then maybe he'll talk to me." Ellery gave her a long, unreadable look. "If you go to him, take that envelope. But remember what Daly wrote. If you see them, don't speak," she whispered. "Yes," Ellery said, his voice low. "Because whatever that means, Daly believed it enough to die keeping it quiet." Evelyn placed the envelope back into her bag, the words still echoing in her mind. As she left the building, she caught her reflection in the glass door, faint, doubled by the rain, and for a moment she could have sworn someone was standing behind her. She turned. The hallway was empty, but the reflection lingered half a second too long before fading. The wind carried the scent of rain and rust as Evelyn pulled into the overgrown driveway of the old Holden farm. The mailbox was crushed, the windows clouded with grime. Somewhere beyond the orchard, a screen door banged rhythmically in the wind, like a heartbeat left behind. She hesitated before stepping out of the car. In her bag, the envelope felt heavier than paper should. Ellery's warning echoed in her mind. "If you see them, don't speak." Retired Sheriff Walter Holden lived alone now, in the same farmhouse where he'd been raised. Once a pillar of the Hollow Creek community, he'd withdrawn from public life decades ago. Rumor said he refused all interviews about the Marston case. Others said he still talked to them, the ones who disappeared. When Evelyn knocked, the door opened a few inches, held by a rusted chain. A single gray eye peered through. "You're not local," the voice rasped. "My name's Evelyn Shaw. I'm a journalist. I'm here about the Marston family." The chain didn't move. Silence stretched between them, long enough for Evelyn to notice the faint smell of wood smoke and something else beneath it. "Film developer." Finally, the chain slid free. The door opened wider. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, but stepped aside anyway. Inside, the farmhouse was dim and cluttered, the air thick with dust. On the mantel sat an old black and white photo, the Marstons at a community picnic, smiling. Evelyn recognized the mother, the father, the 3 children. They looked so alive it hurt to stare. Holden lowered himself into a worn armchair. His hands shook as he reached for the pipe on the table. "Daly sent you?" he asked. "Deputy Daly's been dead for years," Evelyn said softly. "But I found something he left behind." She placed the envelope on the table. Holden's gaze fixed on it. For a moment his breathing hitched. "You opened it," he said flatly. "Yes, I had to." He nodded slowly as if confirming something to himself. "Then it's already begun again." Evelyn leaned forward. "Sheriff, what do you mean?" Holden took a long drag from his pipe, exhaled, and stared into the gray air. "You think that case was about a disappearance," he said. "It wasn't. It was about something that came back." Evelyn frowned. "Came back?" He turned to her, eyes glassy with age but sharp beneath the haze. "You've seen the last photo, haven't you? The one with the reflection?" She nodded. Holden's voice dropped to a whisper. "That 5th figure isn't one of them. It never was." A chill crawled up Evelyn's spine. "Then who is it?" "Not who," he said. "What?" He reached into a drawer beside him and pulled out a cassette tape in a cracked plastic case. The label, faded but legible, read, "Marston, Confession Room, 1973. "Daly recorded this," Holden said. "He said the house was talking that night. I told him he'd been up too long without sleep. Then he played me the tape." He handed it to her, his fingers trembling. We both heard it. A woman's voice whispering things she couldn't have known, things that hadn't happened yet. Evelyn's heart raced. I'm saying the Marstons didn't vanish because of anyone living." The air seemed to thicken around them. Rain beat harder against the windows. Holden's voice broke the silence again, quieter now. "I filed it away under confession. That's what the report said. But there was no one in that room. No body, no suspect. Just that voice." He looked up, eyes hollow. And then Daly disappeared 2 weeks later. Evelyn stared at the tape in her hands, the plastic cold and slick from condensation. "Why keep this all these years?" Holden's mouth twitched, part smile, part regret. "Because I thought someone like you might come someday. Someone who wouldn't just listen but hear." He leaned forward, his whisper ragged and urgent. "When you play that tape, don't do it alone." Before Evelyn could respond, a sharp sound cut through the house. A high-pitched crackle like static from an old intercom. Holden turned toward the corner where an ancient radio sat, its dial glowing faintly, though it wasn't plugged in. A woman's voice, faint but unmistakable, whispered through the static. "Walter, you promised you wouldn't tell." Holden's face drained of color. He staggered to his feet, backing away. "Get out," he rasped. "Go now." Evelyn grabbed the envelope and the tape, stumbling out into the storm. Behind her, she heard the door slam shut and the chain slide back into place. When she looked through the rain-spattered window of her car, Holden was still inside, staring at the radio, lips moving soundlessly. As she started the engine, the cassette on the passenger seat seemed to hum faintly, as if carrying its own breath. The storm followed Evelyn all the way to the edge of Hollow Creek. By the time she reached the bridge, dawn had broken, pale light spilling over the black water that had once carried half the town's stories away. The river wasn't wide, but it ran deep, curling through the valley like a scar that refused to heal. She parked near the guardrail and sat for a moment, the cassette tape in her hand. Its label had started to peel, the ink smudged from her fingers. "Marston, Confession Room, 1973. Holden's voice still echoed in her mind. "When you play that tape, don't do it alone." But she was alone now. Evelyn slid the tape into her old recorder, pressed play, and waited. At first only static. Then faintly a voice, a man's breath, ragged, anxious. It had to be Deputy Daly. "Date, October 21st, 1973, he said, voice trembling. "Sheriff Holden present. Interview room 1. Recording. The sounds from the Marston house. A few seconds of silence. Then the sound of wind. No, not wind. Something moving, whispering through walls. And then came the woman's voice. "You promised, Walter." Evelyn froze. The same phrase she'd heard through Holden's radio. The tone wasn't angry. It was pleading, drenched in sorrow. The tape hissed, then clicked. Another layer of noise seeped in, the sound of running water faint but steady. It wasn't from the room. It was environmental, like a location mic had picked it up. A river, Hollow Creek. Evelyn rewound the tape, listening again. This time she noticed something new. Under the whispers, a low metallic hum. She amplified the sound on her laptop, filtering the background static. The hum sharpened into something rhythmic, mechanical, a pump. Her mind flashed back to old maps she'd studied. Before the Marston house fire, before the disappearance. 50 years ago, there had been a water pumping station half a mile downstream. It was decommissioned in the late 70s, sealed after a flood. If the voice on the tape had been recorded near that river, maybe Daly had gone back there. Maybe the confession room wasn't a room at all. She packed her equipment and drove toward the overgrown trail that led to the pumping station. The rain had stopped, but fog hung thick over the trees, curling around her ankles as she walked. Every step stirred the silence, every breath felt watched. The old station appeared like a ghost. Rusted metal, broken windows, ivy crawling up the walls. The Hollow Creek River rushed below, dark and swollen. Inside, the air was colder. Pipes ran along the ceiling like veins. The sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere below. Evelyn followed it down a spiral staircase slick with moss. At the bottom, she found a concrete chamber, half flooded, walls stained with mineral streaks. And there, against one wall, sat a corroded metal chair bolted to the floor. A microphone cable trailed from it into the water. Evelyn's flashlight shook in her hand. This was no interview room. This was where the recordings had been made. She crouched beside the water, noticing something glinting just below the surface. A piece of metal, small, circular. She reached in and pulled it free. A badge. The engraving was barely legible, but one name still caught the light. F. Daly. Her breath caught. Deputy Daly hadn't just recorded the voice, and he'd died here. A faint hum filled the chamber again, vibrating through the floor. At first she thought it was her equipment, but the recorder was off. The sound grew louder, shifting into the same static tone from the cassette. And then a whisper. "Evelyn?" She froze. The voice came from the water. "Don't let them bury us again." The surface rippled violently as if something had moved beneath it. Evelyn stumbled back, clutching the badge to her chest. Her flashlight flickered, casting fractured light over the walls. And for an instant she saw them. 5 silhouettes standing in the water, heads tilted, motionless. The Marstons, the light died. When it came back, the chamber was empty. Evelyn ran up the stairs, breath ragged, the sound of the river roaring louder behind her. When she reached the door, she turned once more toward the dark below. The hum had stopped. But the water still whispered, faint, endless like a voice caught in the current. She stepped out into the gray morning, clutching Daly's badge and the tape. There was no doubt anymore. This was never just a disappearance. Whatever happened in that house had roots far deeper, buried in the river's flow itself. By morning, Hollow Creek was silent again, the kind of silence that hides something. Evelyn sat inside her car, staring through the rain-streaked windshield at the county sheriff's office, its faded red bricks and flickering porch light barely visible through the fog. The badge she had found in the river lay on the passenger seat, resting beside the cassette. Deputy F. Daly. A name that had disappeared from every file she'd ever seen. Inside, the air smelled of paper and old coffee. The receptionist gave her the kind of glance reserved for strangers asking about things best left buried. Evelyn flashed her press credentials, her voice steady but low. "I'm looking for case file 1971M, the Marston family disappearance." The woman hesitated, then whispered, "That file's sealed. Has been for 50 years. "I know," Evelyn said, placing the badge gently on the counter. "But I think Deputy Daly would want it reopened." The woman's face paled. She disappeared into the back office, and for several minutes, Evelyn waited. The the sound of typewriters and murmuring officers faint behind the glass door. Finally, an older man stepped out. Sheriff Alan Brewer, the same man who'd signed the final closure form in 1973. He eyed the badge, then looked up at her. "Where did you find that?" "Under Hollow Creek." "Near the old pumping station," Evelyn replied. "And this." She set the recorder on the table and pressed play. The sheriff's expression tightened as Daly's trembling voice filled the room, followed by the whisper, "You promised, Walter." When the tape ended, Brewer leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You shouldn't have that," he said. "Why not?" Evelyn pressed. "Because that tape was never supposed to exist." He walked to a filing cabinet, unlocked it, and retrieved a thick, dust-covered folder marked M71. When he opened it, the pages inside were half redacted, names blacked out, photos missing. Daly was new to the force, Brewer began. He was assigned to assist Sheriff Holden on the Marston case, but he got too close, started asking questions Holden didn't want answered. Evelyn flipped through the file. One page stood, "Out," an incident report dated a week after the family's disappearance. The last line was circled in red ink. "Evidence relocated to county storage, per Holden's directive." "What evidence?" Evelyn asked. Brewer hesitated, then opened his desk drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. "Daly left this for me before he vanished," he said. "Told me to keep it safe, in case someone ever came looking again." Evelyn's fingers trembled as she unsealed it. Inside was a single photograph, the Marston dining room, the night they vanished. But there was something different in this image. In the reflection of the glass cabinet behind the table, a figure stood, not one of the Marstons, a man in uniform. Evelyn's breath caught. "That's Holden." Brewer nodded. "He said he left before dinner started. But that photo, that proves he was there after the family was gone." The room felt smaller suddenly. The fluorescent light above flickered. Evelyn closed the file, heart pounding. "So Holden killed them?" Brewer shook his head. "No, it wasn't that simple. The Marstons had something they were never meant to find." He turned to the window, looking out at the rain. "Holden's gone now, died in '92. But before he did, he sent me one letter. Said the river never lies. It only hides what men are too afraid to see." Evelyn stood clutching the file. The air seemed heavier now, like the room itself remembered. "I want to see the storage site," she said. Brewer studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "It's 5 miles out, the old county archives. But if you go before dark, that place hasn't been opened in decades." As Evelyn stepped back into the rain, the storm had returned. Thunder rolled through the valley like distant memory. She placed the badge and the tape in her bag, glancing once more toward the sheriff's window. Brewer was still watching her, not with suspicion but with something closer to guilt. She started the car, the wipers sweeping across the windshield as the road curved toward the hills. The file lay open on the passenger seat, the photograph, staring back at her, the reflection of Holden behind the Marston family, frozen in time. For 50 years, the town had called it a disappearance. But now, with the file reopened, it was something else entirely. A cover-up, a betrayal. And somewhere in the old archives, the truth was still waiting to be found. Next. Chapter 11. The Depth Below, where Evelyn uncovers the final piece hidden beneath the county archives, and the story comes full circle. The road to the old county archives was a narrow strip of cracked asphalt that wound through the hills like a scar left by time. Mist rolled low over the valley, and the smell of wet earth seeped through Evelyn's half-open window. The radio in her car buzzed faintly, catching fragments of static that almost sounded like voices when the signal drifted. By the time she reached the gates, daylight had already started to fade. The Hollow Creek Records Facility, once the nerve center of county investigations, stood silent. Its metal shutters rusted, the words "authorized personnel only" barely visible through years of decay. Evelyn parked and stepped out, flashlight in one hand, the M71 file clutched in the other. She'd read it 3 times during the drive. Each time, the same unanswered question stared back at her. What did the Marstons find that night? Inside, the air was cold and heavy. Dust hung like smoke in the thin shafts of light spilling from broken windows. The corridor stretched endlessly, rows of file cabinets toppled chairs, water damage marking the walls like bruises. She followed the directory signs toward storage section C12, the designation stamped on the final page of the reopened case file. Her boots echoed softly on the concrete floor, each step sounding like a heartbeat inside the silence. When she reached the section, she found a small door sealed by a rusted padlock. The date scratched onto the metal plate above it read November 1971. Evelyn pulled a screwdriver from her bag and pried at the hinge until the lock broke free with a sharp snap. The door creaked open, releasing a wave of stale air that smelled faintly of river mud. Inside were boxes, dozens of them, marked with evidence tags from decades-old cases. But one stood apart. Box M7114. The Marston file. She lifted it carefully onto a nearby table and peeled back the lid. Inside were stacks of photographs, black and white prints, the kind made from film negatives. Each one labeled in faded handwriting, Marston residence at 10 to 1471. She spread them out across the table. The images showed the dining room, the kitchen, the front porch, the children's bedrooms, all frozen moments from that night. But as she studied them, something didn't line up. The photograph from the sheriff's envelope, the one with Holden's reflection, was missing from this sequence. The series jumped from frame 42 to frame 44, frame 43, gone. Her pulse quickened. She checked every envelope, every negative sleeve, nothing. The missing frame, and the one that could confirm who was in that reflection, had been deliberately removed. Evelyn turned over one of the remaining photos and noticed a faint penciled note on the back. Property logged for separate storage on 11-271 W. Holden. Separate storage. She scanned the shelves until she found a narrow metal drawer marked Confiscated Media. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, was a small film reel. Its label read M71 Frame Sequence Backup. Her breath caught. This was it. The missing frame. She carried it to the evidence room's old viewer, brushed away the cobwebs, and fed the film into the machine. The bulb flickered, then glowed, and the first image appeared. The Marston dining room again. But this time the reflection was clearer. The man in uniform was indeed Holden, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood another figure, partially obscured. A smaller man wearing what looked like a deputy's badge daily. Evelyn leaned closer. The frame was grainy, distorted, but unmistakable. Daly wasn't being filmed by Holden. He was standing with him. Her mind raced. What if Daly hadn't been a victim? What if he'd been part of it until something went wrong? Before she could rewind the frame, a sound echoed down the hall. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Evelyn killed the light and held her breath. The steps grew louder, stopping just outside the room. A shadow moved across the doorway, then disappeared. She waited another minute before turning the light back on. The film reel still spun, but the image had shifted. Now the frame on screen showed something she hadn't seen before. The same dining room, but darker, flooded in shadow. And on the table, a camera. The one she'd found in the attic weeks ago. Only this time someone's hand was turning it toward the door, toward whoever had just entered the room that night. Her heart pounded. The missing frame wasn't just proof of who was there, it was a warning. A record of the moment everything changed. The bulb sputtered, then died, plunging the room into darkness. The film reel kept turning, clicking softly until it jammed. Evelyn stood still, her reflection faint in the viewing glass. In that moment, she realized something chilling. Every time she uncovered another piece of truth, the past seemed to move closer, like it wasn't done watching. She packed the reel, slid the photo negatives back into the box, and headed for the door. The fog outside had thickened into a solid wall of white, swallowing the building's outline. As she stepped out, her phone buzzed, an unknown number flashing across the screen. She answered. Only static. Then faintly a voice. You found the frame. Now find what's buried beneath it. The call ended. Evelyn stared into the fog, the sound of the river somewhere in the distance. The ground seemed to hum beneath her feet. She didn't know yet what lay below the archives, But she knew that's where the final truth waited. The fog lingered through dawn, thick as unspoken memory. Evelyn stood outside the archives, the film reel in one hand and the echo of that mysterious call still pulsing in her ears. Find what's buried beneath it. She glanced back toward the decaying building. The floor plan she'd seen in the county records came rushing back. The archives had been built directly above the old courthouse cellar, a structure sealed off after a flood in the late 70s. Beneath that, connected by storm drains, ran the same channel that fed into Hollow Creek. If something was buried below, it wasn't just paper. Evelyn moved around to the back of the building, where the ground sloped sharply toward a drainage ditch. The air smelled of iron and algae. She found a rusted metal grate half hidden under roots and dead leaves, the same kind used for storm access. When she pried it open, cold air rushed up. Damp, ancient, and faintly electrical. A ladder disappeared into the dark below. She switched on her flashlight, took a deep breath, and descended. The tunnel beneath was narrow, built from brick and concrete, with water trickling along the edges. Her light caught markings on the wall, faint spray paint, symbols she didn't recognize, maybe from when the county sealed it decades ago. 50 steps in, she found the first clue. A plaque, corroded but legible. Property of Hollow Creek County Sheriff's Department, storage subsection 71B. Evelyn's heart pounded. The number matched the Marston case file. She followed the tunnel deeper until it opened into a small chamber, the air thick with moisture and decay. Rows of shelves lined the walls, most collapsed under their own weight. But one stood upright, a glass display case, its frame warped with rust. Inside were objects sealed in dust, a child's shoe, a wedding ring, and an old camera, identical to the one she'd found in the Marston attic. The case label read, "Recovered 11/2/71, evidence pending review." She crouched, wiping the glass. Her reflection stared back, pale, tired, blurred by condensation. Behind it, the faint shimmer of water rippled across the floor. Then she heard it, a sound she hadn't heard since the tape. A whisper. "You promised, Walter." Evelyn froze. The voice wasn't from her recorder. It was coming from the chamber itself, soft, distant, layered like a recording caught in the walls. Her flashlight flickered. The reflection in the glass shifted. The room behind her darkened, shapes forming just beyond the beam's reach. 5 faint outlines. The Marstons. They weren't spectral figures in the sense of haunting, more like after-images, imprints of a night replaying itself in loops. The father at the head of the table, the mother beside him, the children seated quietly, faces turned toward something unseen beyond the glass. And standing behind them, Sheriff Holden and Deputy Daly. Evelyn stepped closer, heart racing. The reflection sharpened for a moment, revealing Daly's face, grief-stricken, desperate, and Holden's expression behind him. Calm, resolute, a man carrying out a decision he didn't believe in. Then the light flared, and the reflection shattered into streaks. Evelyn stumbled back. The case cracked, a web of fractures spreading across the glass. Water seeped through, black and cold, rising from beneath the chamber floor. She turned to flee, but something stopped her, a glint beneath the camera's lens. Inside the case, a small metal key lay taped to the bottom. The tag read, "Lockbox 71B." She smashed the remaining glass with a broken pipe, grabbed the key, and ran as water flooded the tunnel behind her. The current was fast, pulling debris and dust through the darkness. By the time she reached the ladder, the chamber had vanished under churning black water. Outside, rain poured again, heavy, unrelenting. She leaned against the wall, drenched, gasping for air. The key glimmered faintly in her palm. It was the last piece, the object Holden had hidden beneath layers of silence and bureaucracy. A lockbox somewhere in the sheriff's archives, sealed since 1971. She looked back toward the fog-thick horizon where Hollow Creek cut through the valley. The whispers had stopped, but the sound of rushing water carried their weight, as if the river itself had been holding this truth, waiting for someone to listen. Evelyn tucked the key inside her jacket, her resolve hardening. The case wasn't just reopened, it was alive. And now, whatever had been buried under glass, under years, under guilt, was coming back. She stepped into her car, headlights cutting through the mist, the reel and the badge resting beside her. The recorder on the seat flickered to life for the first time without her touching it. Static. Then, a voice. The lockbox. Under Holden's desk. Evelyn froze, her pulse drumming. The message ended, and the recorder went silent again. She started the engine and drove toward the sheriff's office, the fog parting just enough for the outline of the town to emerge ahead. Somewhere in that building, beneath the old floorboards, the truth waited, not just about the Marstons, but about everyone who'd stayed silent after. The echo under glass had spoken. Now it was time to listen.